Greetings on this May Day. My name is Bishar Dumani, Professor of History and Mahmoud Darwish Professor of Palestinian Studies at Brown University. I welcome you on behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies and the New Directions in Palestinian Studies initiative at Brown. Very, very happy to host today Nadim Bawalsa to discuss his book, Transnational Palestine, Migration and the Right of Return Before 1948, published by Stanford University Press in 2022. In contextualizing the current moment we are in, the number used most often is 75 years of colonial rule, of statelessness, of the denial of Palestinians to exist as a political community, of fighting for the right of return, of the global nature of the Palestine question, and so on. But as Nadim Bawalsa shows, the number 100 would be more appropriate. These processes and these issues started for the Palestinians well before 1948. And I look very much forward to our discussion. The format will be a brief introduction by Nadim Bawalsa, followed by a couple questions from myself, and then we open it up for the last 30 minutes to question and answer. Please make sure you write your question on the Q&A, and both of us will see it, and we'll try to get in as many as we can. But first of all, let me introduce quickly. Nadim Bawalsa is the Associate Editor of Journal Palestine Studies. He's joining us from Amman, Jordan. His book, Transnational Palestine, was the winner of the 2023 Nikki Keddie Award by the Middle East Studies Association and the 2023 Palestine Book Award. His other writings have appeared in the Jerusalem Quarterly, Nakba, Report on the Americas, the Journal of Palestine Studies, Al-Shabaka, which is the Palestinian Policy Network, and in 2 edited volumes by Routledge on the Middle East Mandates and Diaspora Migration Studies. Nadim Bawalsa earned his PhD in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies from New York University in 2017, and an MA from the Arab Studies from Georgetown University in 2010. Welcome, Nadim.
Thank you so much. Good evening from Amman. I'm so sorry I'm unable to be with you today in person as initially planned. But the 2 flights I would have taken to the US were canceled over the last couple of weeks due to the evolving situation in the region. So thank you to the team at the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown, and especially to you, Professor Bishara Dumani, for inviting me today to speak to you virtually about the book. It's a great honor to be here. So I will share the screen and all right. So Transnational Palestine traces the journeys of the pioneering Palestinians who first started boarding ships bound for the Americas a century and a half ago in pursuit of political stability and economic opportunity. It traces their migration and settlement patterns and the radical transformations that impacted their lives following Britain's occupation of Palestine in December 1917 and the subsequent termination of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, which had ruled Palestine as the southern province of Greater Syria for 400 years. Simply put, these migrants left their homes in Palestine as Ottoman subjects and became stateless Palestinian nationals, banned from permanent return to Palestine following the ratification of the British Mandate in the early 1920s. Their descendants, though nationals of other states today, remain in exile with internationally recognized rights to Palestinian nationality. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll describe these travelers' voyages. I'll outline how Britain orchestrated their exile, and I'll give you a sense for how thousands of them across Latin America responded to the injustice starting in the mid-1920s. I'll conclude with some reflections on the implications of the book's findings for our approach to Palestinian history and even to our current moment. So mass migration to the Americas from Palestine began as it did elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. It began with the invention of the steamship in the early 19th century. Coal proved particularly effective at getting these massive ships across oceans, and port cities throughout the Mediterranean like Beirut, Jaffa, Haifa, and Alexandria quickly opened branches for French, Italian, Turkish, and other boat companies. Migrants from all over Greater Syria, all Ottoman subjects before 1918, took several rather affordable routes westward aboard these ships. The most common route started in Jaffa or Beirut, then through France via Marseille, and then to one of several ports across the eastern the eastern Atlantic seaboard, like New York, Veracruz, Mexico, Rio de Janeiro, Argentina, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, or Buenos Aires, Argentina. This journey took at least 3 weeks, but more arduous journeys often lasted longer than a month. I'll read an excerpt of a Palestinian's journal who migrated to Chile in the 1910s from Bejala, which is a neighboring, the sister town, let's say, of Bethlehem, just south of Jerusalem. It took him 45 days, and the trip was anything but easy. We first went to Lebanon to take the boat. That would be Beirut. We slept the night there. We boarded the boat, and it went to Greece. There, we took another ship. It was gigantic. It was an Italian ship. The first couple of days, we couldn't eat anything. We were all seasick. The first port we came to was Marseille. There we stayed about 5 days, then to Barcelona. After Spain, we arrived to Dakar. In Dakar, we stayed 1 more day, then on to Brazil. The boat stopped in Santos. We slept a night there. Then we went to Rio de Janeiro. From Rio de Janeiro, we continued to Buenos Aires. It took 5 days, completing the 45-day trip with stops included. But his journey didn't end at Buenos Aires. He was on his way to Santiago de Chile, which was no small feat either. Migrants arriving at the port of Buenos Aires would link up with Arabic-speaking middlemen who would supply them with credit lines to cross the continent and get to Chile via Mendoza, the Argentinian border town. There's just one problem. They needed to cross the Andes Mountains, the spine of South America, and the world's longest continental mountain range. Crossing the Andes, even in warmer months, is challenging and requires a certain amount of expertise, so migrants would hire indigenous Mapuche guides to get them across the treacherous terrain on mules to the nearest train station on the Chilean side. But the journey ended with something quite spectacular. What Palestinians found on the other side of the Andes was a landscape and climate that looked and smelled almost exactly like home. The western slopes of the lower Andes bear a striking resemblance to the rolling hills and dry temperate climate of Palestine. It's little wonder then that following an exhausting journey across oceans and continents, these migrants chose Chile as their final resting stop. So who are these migrants from Palestine who happened to find Palestine west of the Andes? Largely, they were Christians from the towns of Bethlehem, Bejala, and Beit Sahur, all just south of Jerusalem, but also from Ramallah, Jerusalem, Nazareth, and elsewhere in Palestine. The pattern of migration was more or less as follows. The first to immigrate were almost always young men who were fleeing unemployment or conscription in the Ottoman army. These youth would initially spend a few months or years in the diaspora, or the mahjar in Arabic, saving enough money to return with remittances and bring along with them parents, siblings, and hopefully a wife to join them on their next voyage westward. Whether fleeing conscription, economic crisis, or Ottoman suppression due to political activism, thousands of Palestinians boarded ships alongside Syrians, Lebanese, Egyptians, Greeks, and other migrants from the Eastern Mediterranean basin, or from the Mediterranean basin, rather, and headed to the New World. Importantly, these migrants regularly returned home to Palestine with bags of money in a tradition of bidirectional travel that became a mainstay of the Palestinian economy by the time of the British Mandate. An exception to this pattern of migration that shows just how rich and layered these narratives of these pioneering migrants were is the story of Katrina Saadeh, pictured here in the center of the photo. This modest Greek Orthodox family, the Saades, from Bethlehem, first immigrated to Kiev in 1906 while it was part of the Russian Empire. Struggling to feed his growing family, Abdullah Saadeh, Katrina's father, seated on the right, wearing a suit, or wearing rather not a suit, but wearing a collared shirt, was drawn to the Russian Empire due to then Tsar Nicholas II's interest in expanding Orthodox commercial networks. Abdullah, like most Palestinian migrants, was a peddler who sold Holy Land items in Kiev, including olive wood crucifixes, rosaries, and mother of pearl. Katrina, 6 at the time of her family's immigration to Kiev, grew up there. But in 1914, with economic calamity across the Russian Empire and with the Bolshevik Revolution brewing, Abdullah fled danger in Kiev and returned home to Bethlehem. But that year also saw the Ottomans' entry into World War I against the Allied forces. An already exhausted economy was now put under wartime siege, and Abdullah couldn't feed all of his children in Bethlehem. So he sent 14-year-old Katrina with her sister and her brother-in-law to Saltillo, Mexico, to marry Jamil Kabandi, also a Palestinian, who'd settled in Mexico a decade earlier and Latinized his name to Emilio. So Katrina, who by then spoke a combination of broken Arabic and Russian, was sent halfway across the world to marry a man she didn't know in a Spanish-speaking country. Certainly, this was better than hunger in Palestine. Katrina arrived in Saltillo, married Jamil, or Emilio, and began a life as part of the town's growing Palestinian Jalia, or a migrant community. Katrina had 2 children with Jamil, but Jamil was killed in a train accident in 1916 during the Mexican Revolution, and one of their children died of the flu that year as well. So by 1921, at the age of 21, widowed Katrina took her surviving daughter Julia and traveled to San Francisco in California, where she joined her sister and brother-in-law and settled with them. There, Katrina had her second marriage to another Palestinian migrant, but this one from Ramallah, Suleiman Farhat. She had 2 children with Suleiman, one of whom is pictured here sitting on his father's lap. The remainder of Katrina's story is fascinating, including fleeing debt during the US Great Depression, briefly returning to her in-laws in Ramallah in Palestine, a family scandal which drove her to run away from Ramallah with 2 of her children and return to the US from Haifa. She had no choice but to leave her 3rd child in Palestine. And finally, divorce from Suleiman in 1936, which to my knowledge is the first transnational Palestinian divorce. Katrina subsequently lived the rest of her life in the US. But I asked Kathy Kenny, Katrina's granddaughter, who shared with me her grandmother's letters from the 1920s and 30s, how her grandmother identified. She was born in Palestine, but she only spent the first 6 years of her life there, and then mere months during her adolescence and early adulthood. Did she identify as Palestinian in California? Did she say she was an Arab? Evidently, Katrina preferred to identify as Syrian if it came to it. So one of the main questions I explore in the book is how migrants self-identified throughout the rapidly changing years before, during, and after World War I, when the colonial boundaries that divided Greater Syria were drawn. After all, the legal and political categories which we use today to designate nationalities in our region didn't exist in their current form just 1 century ago. Historic Greater Syria included Lebanon and Palestine as its western and southern regions, respectively, and what is Jordan today was simply southern Syria. This is to say that while the terms Lebanon and Syria existed before the Europeans carved the region into mandates, they were not used to differentiate politically or nationally between the people of Greater Syria. Rather, Palestinian and Lebanese signified geographic, environmental, cultural, and linguistic variations among Syrian communities, largely aspiring to form a united Arab kingdom. The research appearing in the book indicates that migrants from these regions consider themselves to be first and foremost Syrians, sometimes, though not always, Arabs, and always officially as Ottoman subjects until 1918, as indicated in their travel documents. Their Ottoman travel documents are actually why they were initially registered as Turcos upon arriving at Latin American ports, or Turks. In fact, this misnomer, Arabs are not Turks, was so pervasive and used so widely, it quickly evolved into a racial slur against migrants from the region, one which descendants of these migrants spent decades fighting against. But while it's important to affirm the historical unity of Greater Syria and the enforced fragmentation of these lands, there were nonetheless territorial demarcations put in place by the Ottomans. These porous boundaries were mostly used for taxation and administrative purposes, including Ottoman censuses, which is actually why we're able to ascertain the numbers of migrants from different parts of the empire. Based on Ottoman censuses conducted around the turn of the 20th century, approximately 1.8 million people resided in Greater Syria. Between 1860 and 1920, an estimated 600,000 persons emigrated from the region to both North and South America. As for Ottoman southern Syria, known as Palestine, it consisted of the sanjaks of Akka and Nablus within the state or vilayet of Beirut, as well as the autonomous district known as the Mutasarrifat of Jerusalem, which included Jerusalem, Jaffa, Bethlehem, Al-Khalil or Hebron, Bi'r al-Saba or Beersheba, and Gaza. The population of the two sanjaks and the Mutasarrifat was approximately 600,000 in 1900, and migrants from these areas amounted to roughly 10,000 by the start of World War I in 1914 and over 40,000 by 1936. But Britain's military occupation of Palestine in December 1917 marked the end of Ottoman rule and the transition to a new geopolitical configuration of European mandates, a configuration agreed upon in secret by British and French forces 1 year prior in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The plan was to sever Greater Syria and Iraq at the end of the war to reflect the interests of European forces, leaving us with roughly the borders we know today. By 1922, the League of Nations in Geneva ratified the British and French mandates, which were meant to be temporary, guiding the peoples of the region to self-determination. This short-sighted promise was muddled by yet another British and Zionist scheme, the infamous Balfour Declaration of November 1917, just 1 month before Britain occupied Palestine, in which Britain promised the Zionist Federation to see to the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. How they would do this while honoring their promise to the Palestinians for self-determination as part of an independent kingdom, they simply didn't. The Balfour Declaration featured in the text of the British Mandate for Palestine, which was drafted by British forces in December 1920. Regarding populating Palestine with citizen subjects of the British Mandate, Article 7 of the Mandate stipulated that the government of Palestine in Jerusalem shall enact a nationality law through which it would facilitate the naturalization, as British Palestinian subjects carrying this passport, of the nearly 400,000 Jewish immigrants who would settle Palestine over the course of Britain's 30-year occupation. The nationality law used to naturalize them, known as the Palestinian Citizenship Order in Council, was promulgated in July 1925 and features prominently in the book. Through it, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian citizen certificates were issued, almost all to European Jewish settlers, and tens of thousands were denied to Palestinian migrants. I'll put this slide up with all these figures and just read them to stress just how lopsided citizenship governance or policy was at this time. Between 1925 and 1929, of a total of 20,168 applications for citizenship, 15,551 were approved, with non-Jewish naturalization accounting for only 1%. On March 8, 1937, this is 20 years into the mandate, more than 28,000 Jews had been naturalized in Palestine between 1931 and 36, and of a total of 4,941 certificates of citizenship granted in 1936, 4,847 were for Jews. Meanwhile, by 1937, about 9,000 applications for citizenship had been submitted by Palestinians residing in Latin America, and, quote, of these, not more than 100 were accepted. This continued for the duration of Britain's occupation of Palestine until 1948. As for why British authorities regularly denied Palestinian migrants their applications for citizenship, they had several reasons which Palestinians regularly refuted. Insufficient proof of intention to remain permanently in Palestine, insufficient proof of connection to Palestine, absence for a period longer than 12 years, which was in fact an arbitrary number British authorities regularly changed in their documents or in their correspondences. The migrants, quote, patent undesirability, which actually criteria for which was never explained. The immigration officer was left to determine by themselves whether or not the migrant was desirable. And finally, these migrants, quote, cannot be held to have had direct connection with Palestine except under the Ottoman regime, or to have any legitimate claim to be considered Palestinians or to British protection. Therefore, they are and never have been Palestinians. Meanwhile, Jews entered Palestine virtually without check of any kind, as John Shuckburgh, head of the Middle East Department of the Colonial Office in London, said in May 1925. Excuse me. Of course, British authorities were fully aware of this biased policy. They were also fully aware that they were contravening international law. In 1923, the Allied forces and their defeated Turkish counterparts signed the Treaty of Lausanne, officially ratified a year later in 1924. The treaty delineated the sovereign borders of the new Turkish Republic in exchange for Turkish forces relinquishing all claims to territories they once held in the Arab Eastern Mediterranean. This extended to any claims they held over any residents of these territories, as well as residents of these territories residing abroad, so migrants. As a result, all former subjects of the Ottoman Empire were stripped of Ottoman nationality and came under the trusteeship and responsibility of mandate authorities, which is why all these Palestinians applied for citizenship through British authorities and not through the Ottomans. As for residents of these territories residing abroad, Article 34 of the treaty gave them the right to, quote, opt for the nationality of the territory of which they are natives if they belong by race to the majority of the population of that territory. They could apply for the nationality for which they qualified through race based on 3 legal criteria laid out in the treaty: nationality through birth on the land, through blood lineage, or through long-term residence. The treaty therefore officially promulgated Palestinian nationality globally and protected Palestinians' right to it from wherever they were in the world. This is precisely why thousands of Palestinian migrants applied for Palestinian nationality. They qualified for it through birth or blood. The latter half of the book explores how Palestinians in the diaspora responded to the injustice of the denial of their applications for Palestinian citizenship, namely from Mexico and Chile, which were hubs of Palestinian activism and Arabic printing presses. In dozens of newspapers and hundreds of petitions, Palestinians and their allies across the Americas and in Palestine collaborated in objecting to Britain's abuse of power, demanding redress. They repeatedly accused Britain of contravening international law, especially as it appeared in the Treaty of Lausanne. As an example, in February 1927, members of the Centro Social Palestino of Monterrey, Mexico, addressed this petition to Musa Kadhim al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestine Arab Executive Committee in Jerusalem, and one of the main nationalist leaders, Palestinian nationalist leaders at the time, asking for his help in bringing their troubling case before British forces in Jerusalem. They linked Britain's denial of their nationality to the growing Palestinian nationalist movement, indicating that Britain's policy would forbid them from return to Palestine, thereby harming the nation. Husseini and a group of Palestinian nationalists subsequently marched to the offices of the government of Palestine in Jerusalem with a petition of their own, listing their compatriots' grievances as per the Mexico petition and demanding justice. I want to give you a sense for the language these Palestinian migrants used in their petitions. They'd clearly done their homework. They'd read up on the legal jargon, including the Treaty of Lausanne and Article 34. And they also had read up on the relationship between the League of Nations and the mandates in terms of authority and sovereignty. I'll read excerpts from one petition that I find represents the lot of them. It was written on February 23rd, 1927, by members of the Centro Social Palestino in Monterrey, Mexico. To His Excellency Field Marshal Lord Plumer, High Commissioner, Government of Palestine, Jerusalem, Palestine. Sir, we, the undersigned, native-born Palestinians, residents of the cities of Monterrey, Saltillo, Chihuahua, and San Pedro, Republic of Mexico, do hereby most respectfully solicit your aid in the solution of a problem, which for us is most serious. We've always maintained contact with our native land and continue to cultivate those ties of blood, language, tradition, and all other ethnic and social associations which go to make up a native land. We believe we are entitled to consider ourselves as Palestinians. We were born on that territory, have always wished to be Palestinians, and we are sure if as a last resort it shall become necessary to carry our petition before the League of Nations, that august body will grant us the right to consider ourselves nationals of Palestine. We believe, sir, with all due respect, that the decision of the Palestine government as expressed by you does in no way agree with the spirit of the treaties, nor the clearly manifested intention of the League of Nations to foster, encourage, and revive the small nations which before the war were subject to others. Signed on behalf of the members of the Palestinian colonies by the Centro Social Palestino. Pictured here is the first of 5 pages of over 300 signatures. Please note the letterhead, which says the Hijos de Palestina, or the Sons of Palestine Committee in Saltillo, Mexico, not Monterrey. The first line in Arabic indicates that this committee collected these signatures in Saltillo and then sent them to the Centro Social Palestino in Monterrey, 87 kilometers away, in order to add the names of Palestinians in Saltillo to the Monterrey petition. Palestinians across Mexico's northern corridor were very much connected and very much politically engaged. Over the course of mandate rule in the interwar period, more than 3,000 appeals and petitions reached the League of Nations, which does not mean that they were considered or even opened. The majority, at over 40%, concerned Syria or Palestine more specifically. Palestinians across the Americas also protested British and French mandate policies in newspapers. The National Library in Santiago, Chile, a country which today is home to the largest Palestinian community outside the Arab world, at roughly 500,000, houses more than 10 journals and periodicals published by the migrant community in Santiago alone. The rich Arabic and Spanish sources say a great deal about the daily lives of these migrants, and they also show that following the establishment of the mandates in Greater Syria, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese remained abreast of developments back home, informing one another of the Zionist threat and of the mandate's bias, especially regarding Palestine. They were fully aware of the Balfour Declaration and its implications, including the denial of citizenship to Palestinian migrants in contravention of the Treaty of Lausanne. In issue after issue, for years, newspaper editors warned their readers of the dangers of European imperialism and of the importance of safeguarding the rights of Palestinians to their nationality. They also gave instructions regarding how to go about doing so. For example, in 1927, they urged Palestinian readers to join the, quote, Committee for the Defense of the National Rights of Palestinians, established that year in Santiago. The newspapers therefore indicate a clear shift in self and group identification among Palestinian migrants at the time. While they still identified as Syrians or Arabs, the more British forces denied their rights as Palestinians, the more determined they were to assert their Palestinianness. On April 23, 1927, a Palestinian migrant in Trujillo, Honduras, said the following in a petition to the League of Nations after his application for citizenship was denied. We are Palestinians, born, bred, and reared, and no power on earth can sever our claims and rights as Palestinians. The development of collective Palestinian political consciousness in the early 20th century thus occurred transnationally, not just in Palestine. I'll conclude with a few thoughts about the implications of this book, both for the study of history and for today. What Transnational Palestine indicates is that the historical study of Palestine and the Palestinians need not be limited to geographic Palestine or to British and Israeli colonial archives. Our documents, our historical record, our voices are stored in archives and personal collections across the world, and they house stories desperate to be told. Palestine is absolutely everywhere. Connected to this is the critical idea that Palestine need not be studied in relation to Israel, nor in spite of Israel. Palestine and the Palestinians didn't start in 1948, nor did their stories. That they've not been written into many historical records is ultimately a deliberate act of colonial erasure. What Transnational Palestine aims to do is contribute to the growing effort to remedy this critical gap in the historical record. The book also makes clear that the British mandate for Palestine was designed with fundamental inequities that at no point throughout their occupation of Palestine did British authorities seek to rectify. In fact, the success of the mandate was arguably predicated on these inequities. Connected to this is the blaring truth that whether 100 years ago or today, Palestine continues to be an exception when it comes to the application of international law, and that British mandate forces set this precedent. By the time they left Palestine in 1948, British forces had effectively exiled 40,000 Palestinians. The subsequent colonizers of Palestine, the Zionists, have simply been continuing this exile. What this means for the ongoing pursuit of Palestinian liberation in colonized Palestine and across the world is that we must first and foremost realize the extent of our exile, the extent of our numbers, of our resources, experiences, potentials. In fact, our exile is so expansive, so old, and so ongoing, we actually have no clue how many of us Palestinians there are out there. This can no longer be the case, certainly not today with our growing transnational movement. Our ancestors in Mexico, Chile, Honduras, and beyond taught us that we should use our numbers and our geographic fragmentation to our advantage. The very fact that our struggle to belong to Palestine from exile began in 1925, not 1948, and that it includes millions of descendants of Palestinians around the world today should compel us to forge networks of Palestinians, to literally come together and register our great numbers as a first step in order to collectively strategize alongside our allies how to safeguard our connections to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. However we choose to do it, our diaspora is much more significant than we know. And it's my contention through this book that it's high time that we activate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nadim. This is terrific, especially the last part in which you laid out a whole range of issues, which I hope we'll have time to discuss. But first, allow me maybe a couple of specific questions. One has to do with the motivation to return and acquire citizenship in Palestine. What do your sources tell you about the primary reasons people, obviously not everyone who left was doing this, but some people were. Can you give us an idea as to why?
Absolutely. There's different reasons. The most basic one would be that what nationality, so citizenship was a new phenomenon at this point, right, for subjects, former imperial subjects. What citizenship entailed through British legislation was rights to inheritance, rights to property, rights to employment in Palestine upon return, rights to live as a national of the mandate that would turn into a nation state, presumably. Without this nationality, none of these rights were secured. So that's sort of the main thing that became clear to not just the migrants, but to nationalists in Palestine who were saying, what do you mean our relatives and friends can't apply for this citizenship? You know, we need them, sort of, as I explained, the migrants' remittances and migrants' businesses abroad and sort of the ability to travel back and forth for decades before the war was a mainstay of the Palestinian economy. So for many Palestinians in Palestine, this was a serious threat to their livelihoods, the survival of their communities, sort of the economic viability of Palestinian society. The more political reason is sort of a demographic issue. The more Jews were being allowed in and naturalized, and the less Palestinians were allowed to do the same, this was a direct threat to the nationalist movement, who saw that clearly, as we know the British to have done throughout the Mandate period, that they were prioritizing not just naturalizing, but settling, employing, giving land to incoming Jewish settlers at the expense not only of the Palestinians in Palestine, but also those residing abroad. So many of their properties were taken through not being, so by disenfranchising them and not awarding them citizenship, this meant that their lands were much more easily taken.
So let's take these two issues in turn. One has to do with the relationship between citizenship as a legal category and property.
Yes.
And the other one has to do with citizenship and legal rights and national question. If we go to the question of property for just a second, how is this related to marriage? Were these migrants going back, marrying from Palestine? Did they own lands? Did they have family members? Were these families split up so that some remained and some were away, and the ones who remained managed the lands? You can imagine that after a generation, the question of inheritance would become and property devolution would become incredibly important.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the marriage? Because your great
Yeah.
example about Katrina in the beginning had her question of mobility, property, and marriage and citizenship all combined into one person.
Absolutely. So I'll just say, Katrina is an exception, not just because it's a woman whose story is being told, but and also because she, in many ways, forfeited benefited anything to do with the region, right? So there wasn't this alarm at the sense of return. But this is mostly because her family didn't have much based on the records, based on the letters that she was exchanging with her sister. It was her husband and his family who were her husband, Suleiman, the second one, in Ramallah, whose family was very determined that whatever assets they still had in the US, they liquidate them and bring them back to Palestine, which wasn't Katrina's agenda at all. So she wanted out of the family politics, the family finances completely. She wanted out of the family entirely, which is why she fled and then thought, well, I won't go back ever. She never did. So her story is quite exceptional. But when it comes to property and marriage, so Cecilia Beza, a political scientist, but also sort of wears a historian hat as well. She wrote the most sort of comprehensive or explanatory essay in JPS actually about these early communities and how central endogamy was to their success. So marriage was so central to not only to the economic viability of these communities, because they would just increase numbers in the mahjar, in the diaspora, right, by having children and staying there and raising them to contribute or to join the family business and so on. But also because it would ensure that the viability and the continuance of the hamule, or the tribe, or the sort of the larger family. So the larger the family, the more successful it was in the diaspora and in Palestine. So up until the British arrived and the European forces arrived, there was no sense that what happened in the Mahjar was separate from what happened in the Watan, or the homeland, right? So any marital arrangements that were thought of in one affected the other. And there was never, until the second generation, when they started intermarrying with locals, with Chileans, let's say, and Mexicans, all wives were brought. It's horrible to say that, but were sought from Palestine, let's say. So during these trips back, and this, I think Akram Khatir makes this argument in his book Inventing Home, about the Lebanese case in this period, and just how important this back and forth travel, with or without the spouse, was for these travelers. There's also some interesting stories in the book. So gender is not, unfortunately, a theme that I could dwell on as much as I would have liked to in the book, but there are incredible stories from the periodicals and the newspapers of women being the first migrants, not just Katrina,
Right.
other women sort of leaving the homeland in search of their betrothed, looking for them because they've gone astray, because they hadn't heard from them for months or years, and they went to fetch them and so on. So this was very much part of the aspect. So migration was described as a disease that had inflicted every part of the homeland. In one of the periodical articles that I read in the 1920s. So everyone was somehow inflicted with this bug, right? To get on ships and head abroad, women, men. And of course, marriage alliances, let's say, also brought families together, different families together. So for example, the Jasirs and the Qattans from Bethlehem, the incredible palaces today, or the incredible villas today in Bethlehem, were largely built by money from
Right.
Qattan and Jasir migrants from the Americas. And these families were recreated in the diaspora as well. There are Qattans, Jasirs, Saids, Sayers. All these families were recreated, and this sort of transnational. That's why, in many ways, the book is titled this, because it's not just Palestine defying sort of borders that were enforced on it. It's Palestinians also recreating Palestine everywhere that they went, and marriage was central to that, absolutely.
It was indeed, and we saw that in 1948 in the refugee camps, and the work of Rosemary Sayer, how they recreated their families and their villages, even in the refugee camps.
Yes.
So let's get to the other side of the question, which has to do with the politics of citizenship. Why did the Palestinian national movement not make a big deal out of this issue?
So from the sources, well, of course, the sources are biased, right? They tell the story that the words and the document says itself. So it's not that they didn't make a big deal out of it, because throughout the nationalist period, or excuse me, throughout the mandate period, especially the 1920s, as the movement itself was starting, and as they were sort of trying to Musa Kadhim or Haj Amin or Raghib Nashashibi, the big shots, as they were trying to sort of establish themselves and build a case against not just the Zionists, but the British, of course, the more grievances they could present, the better. So grievances from the Mahjar were actually quite important for this. And Palestine newspaper in Palestine actually would republish a lot of the migrants' petitions and letters for years. I would argue that into the 30s, by the time that the nationalist movement was faltering, and by the time that it was the Palestinian, the Fallahin, the people in Palestine who were sort of leading the revolution by the mid-30s and into the Great Revolt, there was, I would say, just an overall exasperation with not the fact, not just the reality of being unable to help sort of family members and business associates and neighbors and whomever in the diaspora, but also the very inability and ongoing frustrations of not being able to affect any change in British policy in Palestine for Palestinians in Palestine, right? The other aspect to this is that by the late 20s, so by the time they were left stateless nationals, and by the time they started realizing that there was no budging with the British after several petitions and pleas and so on, they started applying for residencies in the countries where they lived, right?
Yeah.
So it became sort of, in a way, they gave up, saying, well, we may not be able to become Palestinian nationals, but at least we can still go back as on travel visas, right? Visitor visas as Mexicans or Chileans or whatever. So the important thing for them became in the Mahjar became registering and how they registered, right? Because there were also immigration quotas. So they didn't want to be registered as Asians or African. It was very important for them to be registered as whites, which is politics of race when it comes to
I
migration.
was just about to ask you that question, but we've already addressed it. So the politics of race, we might have to leave to another time because I want to bring in some of the questions that we're getting on the Q&A. But before I do, there is a word that was repeated often in their letters, as you show, and that is the word native.
Mm.
So what did that word mean to them? Is this something they just picked up from the way that the British were talking about what it means to be native and what gives you the right to be there, and therefore they used it? Or is this something that you find in their writings, in their newspapers? Do they elaborate on the issue of what it means to be a native, especially since when they left, there was no Palestine
Mm.
in the formal sense of a state, and the overwhelming majority felt that they were part of Syria in general.
Right.
So,
So
what does it mean to be native for them, do you think?
that's a brilliant question, and of course it opens up a very big discussion about also indigeneity
Right.
and the term indigenous native, which is used when I would say that based on the records and based on how deliberate they were in using the word native in English,
Mhm.
not in they weren't calling them each other natives to Musa Kadhim al-Husseini,
Right. So, what words did they use when they wrote in their newspapers or talked to each other?
Abna al-Watan,
Uh-huh.
Ahjar, sons of the nation. That's what it was. It was more nationalistic because they were addressing them, these missives to nationalist leaders.
Right.
I would say that to British authorities, it was to prove connection to the land because Article 34 said belonging to the territory by race to the native population.
Right.
So using that, we can't be more native. We have the blood ties, we have the language, we have the ethnicity, we have the family ties, we have, right? So native here takes on a very sort of blood definition.
Right.
It's not about ownership of land in these petitions. It's not about even birth there. That does come up, but nativity based on race and blood connection to the majority of the people on that land trumped everything else, because that's how it was written into the Treaty of Lausanne. If nationality was determined first and foremost by blood, then by birth on the land, then by residency, then there was a need to, then property didn't matter, nothing mattered. We're from there. How can you tell us we're not?
I'm so sorry that we don't have as much time to keep going on this line of questioning. So I want to open it up to other kinds of questions that we're getting. One is from Diana Nabulsi. It says, thank you for this great talk. I was wondering if you can speak a bit more about the initial immigrant communities. As you mentioned, they were primarily Christian men. If you could expand on the reasons for that, and please answer quickly because we're going to have another question.
Yeah. Absolutely. The Ottomans by the time World War I was starting, but even before, during the Balkan Wars in 1910 and 12, were starting to conscript Christians in the army, not just Muslims. It was a Muslim army historically, but preparing for war, the draft was extended, or the conscription orders were released, extending to Christians. There was a huge flight of Christians from the region, not just from Palestine, Lebanon and Syria as well. And importantly, Muslims who also wanted to flee the draft did so as well in many different ways, and many times just jumping on a boat, and then registered as Christians upon arrival, wherever they went, right? So, when you're fleeing war and conscription, I think you'll write whatever religion allows you to get out, right? Or enter whatever country you're going to. So this was a phenomenon of all religious sects, but there was a higher proportion of Christians because the community was so small and there was such fear that this would lead to an annihilation of the community. So send off the young men immediately.
Right. And this question is by Enrique Salas, if I pronounce it correctly. Of the 33 countries in Latin America, wherever Palestinians migrated to, which have the least known coverage and historical exploration? Where in the globe are Palestinian history still dormant? By dormant, I suppose they mean understudied.
Yes.
Now, you talked a lot about Chile. Everybody talks about Chile.
Yes. Yeah.
And Mexico to a certain extent.
Exactly. So Chile and Mexico, as I said, they're hubs of migration. So Chile being the largest, having the largest community, but that's not the reason why Chile's coverage of Palestinian its Palestinian history is more let's say fuller than other contexts. Actually, Honduras has the highest per capita number of Palestinians outside the Middle East. It's actually about, of course, the country the country you're speaking of, the political situation, the economic situation is huge as well, because we have to also, apart from sort of the race aspect of migration studies, there's also the class aspect, and for many of these Palestinians, they made it quite successfully and entered virtually every big part, let's say, or every sort of there is a Palestinian behind every sort of successful, let's say, a sector in Chile, for example, government, banking, textile, industry. Palestinian families are quite successful there. So, and it's similar in other contexts as well, like Honduras. Many of these wealthier communities have tended towards right-wing politics over the last, maybe not century, but since the socialist revolutions, since the mid-20th century. So a lot of that history is still sort of muddled or censored and not spoken about. And for lack of a better term, we're talking about mafia communities in many ways. right? So some of these exceptionally wealthy, powerful people are inaccessible, right? And have very strong sort of intercommunal, interfamily networks. And by this point, they might recognize that they have a Palestinian ancestor, but there's no sort of direct association apart from my great-grandfather immigrated here, that kind of thing, right? So the other aspect, the other parts of the world, I would just love to reference. This is something I always love to say. Jacob Norris, who's a brilliant historian, also of similar period, Bethlehem specifically, and migration as well in Latin America, found records of Palestinians in the Philippines as early as the 1890s, I believe. They were selling mother of pearl, which was the Bethlehem item exported out of Bethlehem. So we could be anywhere. And the other thing is that how we were registered upon arrival, were we registered as Turks, Arabs, Asians, right? And that could obscure our actual origins, right? So it's very hard to determine that, but now we're seeing, I gave a talk in Amman 2 years ago, and someone in the audience raised her hand during the Q&A and said, I'm Mexican, and I just saw my great-grandfather's name on one of the slides you showed. I had no idea that he was doing that 100 years ago, let alone that he was part of a migrant community. So there is, hopefully the book helps in doing this, but there is growing awareness across the world, especially with what keeps happening in Palestine, about sort of activating these communities through different means, and recognizing that really all it takes is one ancestor to be from Palestine, and that qualifies you for blood relation, right? And many, how ironic that this is the birthright of many, of how many Jewish folks end up going to Palestine, right? Actually that applies, that nationality law applies to Palestinians everywhere in the world today as well. It's just about dismantling Zionism first, I suppose, and then seeing about the rest.
So, just a quick question. You mentioned that politics are affected very much by class. So regardless of they're Palestinian or not, since they did well in some of these countries, many of them were on the right side of the spectrum, not right correct, but the right left side of the spectrum. Can you tell us about the different communities in Latin America, besides Chile and Mexico and now Honduras, that researchers have not really looked at and should?
I would say that just based on the sources, the petitions I found from different places, there may actually not be a single inch of Latin America that is not worth exploring for this very reason. I heard through, I can't remember where I learned this, but the largest population of Bejalis or Bejalis, Palestinians from Bejala, is in fact in Peru. And Colombia, or it might be Bethlehemites, Colombia, Peru, Bejala. But the petitions were coming in, I mean, the Caribbean islands, Haiti, Cuba. There were petitions from Jamaica as well. Was that in the book?
No.
Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, of course. Salvador was a big one, a big one. As well. The Palestinian newspaper had a very strong, Palestinian newspaper in Jaffa and Jerusalem had a very strong connection with El Salvador. So they were regularly reprinting petitions and letters from Palestinians there. Who else was there? Which other, of course, so the big hubs always in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. Absolutely. There's also the sense that you could say that these hubs of migration first attracted Lebanese and Syrians because they were the first to set sail. And some historians have argued that Palestinians chose not to settle in them as much because they had already been sort of saturated with the same goods and the same exports and the same imports from the region. So they went to Chile and areas on the Pacific. But there are definitely Palestinian migrants who stayed in Buenos Aires, who stayed in Rio de Janeiro, who stayed in Veracruz, Interestingly, I think Mexico has such a fascinating history because of its proximity to the United States, because you don't see Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians, for that matter, settling in the major metropolitan hubs of Mexico, like Mexico City. They stayed on the frontier, on the northern border frontier, in order to have easier access to the United States, which was a big part of why they wanted to venture to the New World to begin with. And Sarah Gautieri talks about these Arab pathways in her book. I think that's the
Right.
name of the book. Just how important El Paso, Texas was as an entry point for these migrants into the United States. So they're on the northern corridor of Mexico. They're in the oh my gosh, in the Amazon. I found books, literature written about Lebanese immigrants, but wherever you would have found a Lebanese or Syrian migrant, a Palestinian would have eventually come and become their neighbor, right? So even if you weren't able to go live in exactly the same community where your neighbors from Bethlehem or Beit Jala migrated to, you would find an Arabic speaker somewhere. The Atacama Desert in northern Chile had a community as well of Palestinians. They were apparently troublemakers and the newspapers in Chile would always reprimand them for embarrassing the community. Right? So I think let's
There's a
go
lot of work to be done
anywhere
on
in America. Absolutely.
So one last question, if I may. Uh, you talked about the first generation bringing in the what you call women or wives from Palestine. Second generation marrying locally
Yeah.
to a large extent, but we have two generations after that. What can you tell us about this generation, and how are they relating to their sense of self and to the Palestine question in general?
Thank you very much for that last question. It allowed me to tell you about some phenomenal people I met while I was in Chile. So let's say this generation, my generation, folks in their 30s, 20s, older, younger, there has been a resurgence and an identification with Palestine. Certainly, it's always because of what's happening in Palestine, obviously, right? So at no point in the 20th century was Palestine at ease. We know this, but in the earlier generations, the 20s and 30s, because of the trouble of assimilating and wanting to assimilate as locals and to be seen less as undesirable immigrants like the Asians or the Africans, right? There was a concerted effort to Latinize and to Westernize as much as possible, which included naming children Spanish names or Latin names. So we see a generation of folks like Jamil, Emilio. In any case, generations of children being born and this is a phenomenon of diaspora all over the world. Then there was a resurgence of sort of after 48, after 67, of these folks having children, naming them Arabic names. So I met Karims, Samis, Constantines, Anwars, folks with very sort of Arab names, and of course taking both the maternal and the paternal last names as well, which is a beautiful thing. So sometimes they could have two Palestinian last names if both parents are Palestinian, which is, I think, a beautiful fusion. And also looking at Chile more specifically, during the Pinochet years, they're sort of a stain on the collective memory of the people, and in particular for the Palestinians, because of how popular the Palestinian cause is there, and how difficult it is for them to rid themselves of the fact that for many of these affluent Palestinian families, the politics did not align with the revolution. They were, let's say, right-leaning at the time during the Pinochet years. So now there's a concerted effort among younger generations to sort of counter that by being adamantly Palestinian, joining in and not just sort of indigenous protests and struggles of the Mapuche people in Chile, especially, but against anything capitalist, any privatization efforts of public transport, of water, right? So there is a very active, let's say, community of Palestinians or descendants of Palestinians today with Arabic names, Latinized last or hyphenated last names, who don't speak a word of Arabic but know a lot about Palestine and care a lot about sort of carrying the struggle, not just the Palestinian one, but as an intersectional global one as well. And these are the folks I really hope sort of benefit a lot from this book as well, as sort of realizing their history as well. It's something that many folks there told me that we would have never known that these documents exist in our archive because we don't speak or read Arabic. No one here comes, no one from over there comes here to study us or to study our history, right? So, inshallah.
Inshallah, that's a great word to end on. Your book is, I recommend it highly. It's a gateway to another Palestinian past and a beacon to a different kind of Palestinian future is the best way I can maybe put it together. Thank you very much, Nadim Bawalsa, for joining us here at the Center for Middle East Studies and the New Directions of Palestinian Studies at Brown University. I wish you were with us in person, but hopefully we'll have a chance to host you again.
I hope so too. Thank you so much, Professor Damani. I
Yeah.
appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much for joining us.